Colonialism and tribal societies. A tribe can be defined as people belonging to the same race, inhabiting a specific region of the country, using same language, and practicing the same culture and religion. The scheduled tribes in India are generally considered to be Adivasis, literally meaning indigenous people or original inhabitants. Scheduled tribe is an administrative term used for the purpose of administering certain specific constitutional privileges, protection, and benefits for the specific sections of the people considered historically disadvantaged and backward. The branch of science which deals with the study of tribal culture and lifestyle is called anthropology. As tribals have mostly led an isolated and nomadic life, it is very difficult to learn about them. Tribes have always existed in Indian subcontinent, and their existence can be traced to the Indus Valley civilization. References of tribes are available in Mahabharata. But tribes were never really a part of mainstream Indian life. They have always had a different socio-economic, politico-religious structure which continue to be an integral part of the traditional Indian social structure. A tribal group speaks a definite language, belongs to a distinct racial group, follows a typical religion, and performs different rituals. Tribals live in a natural surrounding. Depending on their physical environment, they practice a variety of economic activities like hunting, fishing, food gathering, and farming, etc. Family is the basic social unit of the tribal communities. Women perform various domestic and economic functions. Sometimes they are also engaged in agricultural operations. British colonial rule had a tremendous impact on their isolated and peaceful lives. The colonial state allowed the zamindars and moneylenders to plunder the tribal economy. Trivia: a colony is a part of an empire, and so colonialism is closely related to imperialism. They were deprived of their means of livelihood and were forced to adopt a new lifestyle. Many a times, they protested to save their territories and environment. Some noted tribal protest movements of the 18th century, which continued throughout the 19th century, were aimed at rebelling against these exploitative British strategies. Changes within tribal societies and economies. Some of the tribes like Gonds were able to form their independent states during the medieval period, as did the tribes of Northeast region. Gonds ruled over the independent Gondwana state from the 14th to 18th century until they were subjugated by the Marathas. They primarily lived by hunting, fishing, and food gathering. The Santhals have continued to be a sedentary cultivators, although many of them switched over to casual work in plantation, mines, and industry. The Bhils were nomadic by nature, but they have taken to sedentary life of settled cultivators. Such changes in the lives of tribals were brought about due to their interaction with non-tribals. Indian tribes learned the art of agriculture quite early in the history. The land settlement policies introduced by the British adversely affected the traditional joint ownership structure of the tribals and created a lot of unrest in their societies. The government activities exercising exclusive control over forests and plundering forest wealth infuriated the tribals, who viewed it as an attempt to dislocate them. The activities of the Christian missionaries were also objected by some of the tribal societies. The developmental activities like mining, laying of roads, and railway tracks in the hilly and forested area depleted the resources of the tribals, bringing uncertainty, misery, and poverty among them. It had an adverse impact on their society. The introduction of various other kinds of laws were perceived as imposition of foreign culture by the tribals. Many of the tribal movements were directed against the landlords who exploited them by levying heavy taxes on them and restricted shifting cultivation in the forests. The religious movements and various other socio-religious reform movements introduced by the British were also unacceptable to many tribal societies. British wanted to keep the tribes isolated because they had realized that tribal people can be a potent force to deal with in the national movement. The steady expansion of British rule in India slowly began to affect the traditional lifestyle of the tribals. The colonial rule brought an end to the barter economy of the tribal societies and instead introduced a cash economy. With this, merchants initiated commercialization of agriculture. In order to grow cash crops, they acquired large tracts of agricultural land of the tribals and weakened their self-contained economy. Trivia: by 1920, nomadic pastoral tribes represented over a quarter of Iran's population. Tribal revolts. Many tribal groups rose in revolt due to above-mentioned exploitative policies of the British. Some of the noteworthy tribal protest movements were those of the Bhils in Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra regions, Kols in Bengal, Bihar and Odisha, the Mundas in Bihar, the Gonds in Odisha, the Khasis in Meghalaya and the Santhal in Bihar and Bengal. Information about these revolts is available in tribal legends and folk songs as well as government records. In some instances, tribal rebels have regarded the leaders of the uprising as God's representative on earth. On the other hand, British government records regard these revolts as unlawful activities to be suppressed with brutal force. The historians carefully study both the tribal and the government records to learn the true history of these revolts. Tribal revolts in Northeast region. The northeastern region of India consists of 7 states, also referred as 7 sisters, namely Assam, Meghalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Tripura, Mizoram and Nagaland. Tribal population is quite dominant in this region. Due to continued oppression, many tribal communities stood in protest against the exploitation at the hands of British rulers. Manipur. The disunity amongst the princes of Manipur royal family led to a war between his kingdom and the British. When the king of Manipur died, his eldest son succeeded him to the throne. Surchandra was overthrown by Tikendrajit, who occupied the throne with the help of members of royal family. The British government declared war against Manipur in 1891. Tikendrajit and his followers fought very bravely but were defeated in the war. Tikendrajit was captured and hanged by the British. A memory called Bir Tikendrajit Park was built at the spot where he was hanged. Meghalaya. After British acquired the Diwani rights in Bengal, Bihar and Odisha, they wanted to build a road linking the Brahmaputra and the Surma valleys. This road had to pass through Khasi hills dominated by Khasi tribe. The pleasant climate of Khasi hills also made the British think of building a sanitarium in this place. The Khasis stood in revolt against the British to construct a road passing through their area, joining Silbet and the newly occupied Burmese areas. The Khasis revolted under the leadership of Tirut Singh. They burnt the European settlements, released the convicts employed in the construction of roads. They created much panic among the British officials. The British force had to face great difficulty in dealing with them. Ultimately, Tirut Singh surrendered in January 1833. Assam. In Assam, the land tax that the farmers had to pay to the government was quite high. It is said that in Kamrup and Darang regions of Assam, the British increased the tax by 50 to 70%. The British government confiscated the lands of those farmers who were unable to pay taxes. This led to a series of protests by the farmers against the British administration. Under the guidance of local leadership, large groups of farmers assembled in public places to fight against the British, but the British easily suppressed the rebels. Tribal revolts in Chota Nagpur region. The Chota Nagpur region consists of thickly forested hills and plateaus extending in the states of Jharkhand, Odisha and West Bengal. It forms the habitat of several tribes including Mundas, Gonds, Santhals and Kols. The Cols were the first to rise in revolt against the British because of the gradual extension of the British authority in their area. These freedom-loving people guarded their frontiers for a long time and did not allow strangers to enter their territory. They resisted the attempts of the British officials to enter their territory. Many of their people were killed and villages were burnt. In 1827, they surrendered, but only temporarily. Santhals. Santhals owned large tracts of land and believed that their lands were blessed by their ancestors. Thus, they were very attached to their lands and forests for economic and religious reasons. Due to the new system of land revenue called permanent settlements, Santhals were completely deprived of their ownership of land. They were reduced to the status of tenants and were obliged to pay land revenue to the British through the zamindars. As the British rule expanded, roads and railways were laid down to facilitate the penetration of colonial rule. In 1853, work started on the construction of railway line, and it was expected that it will give employment to around 1 lakh people. As the Santhals realized the disadvantages of the introduction of railways and its effect on their traditional lifestyle, the poor Santhals were forced to borrow money from the moneylenders in order to pay their taxes. The cruel moneylenders saw to it that the Santhals were put to prison if they failed to repay the debts within specified time. It was observed that the alienation of land on a large scale with the tacit approval of British administration was the main reason for this rebellion. Organized on a vast scale, the revolt swept across the region of Santhal from Bihar to Odisha. Frustrated by the repeated attempts on their part to seek justice from courts, the peasants raised their voice. It finally resulted in a series of open revolts against the British. The revolts are collectively called Santhal Liberation Movement. On 30th January 1855, a large crowd of Santhals assembled in a farm in the village of Bhagnadihi in Santhal Pargana. They declared themselves to be free from British rule. They vowed to drive the British out of their land. These developments shocked the British. During the course of their war with the British, Santhals were able to gain control over a large territory extending from the Rajmahal Hills to Birbhum. The British rule in these areas temporarily came to an end. Historians have expressed shock at the brutalities committed by the rebels, but chose to ignore the humiliation that peasants had to suffer in the hands of moneylenders and the landlords. The Santhals killed many British officials and moneylenders. It forced the colonial administration to declare martial law in the area, where tribals succeeded in destroying even a semblance of British rule. The Santhal rebellion was finally crushed by the British troops. It was an unequal fight, but the peasants were armed with bows and arrows on one side and soldiers were equipped with firearms on the other. Although the rebellion was largely suppressed in 1856, it continued in some areas till 1857. As a result of these revolts, the Santhal Pargana Tenancy Act was passed. The act provided certain concessions to the Santhals. They were assured protection against imperialist exploitation. The regular police force was abolished in tribal areas. Instead, the responsibility to maintain law and order was given to the village headman. Munda Rebellion. The Munda Rebellion was one of the prominent tribal protests in the subcontinent. Birsa Munda led this movement in the region south of Ranchi. This rebel movement during 1899 to 1900 was known as Ulugan or Great Tumult. The Mundas traditionally enjoyed a preferential rent trade as the original clearer of the forest. But in the 19th century, this land system was eroded by merchants and moneylenders. During British rule, many non-tribals migrated to the traditional tribal areas and grabbed the land owned by the tribal groups. In due course, the tribals were forced to work as laborers under non-tribals. The rebellion was aimed to drive away the British and establish Munda rule in this region. Birsa Munda was a strong young man who claimed to have divine powers. The locals considered him the god's representative on earth. He strongly protested against the non-tribals occupying tribal lands. He also disliked the zamindars and moneylenders who ill-treated Mundas. He advised Munda farmers not to pay rent to the zamindars. The entire Munda community joined under the leadership of Birsa Munda, who started the revolt in Chota Nagpur region. They attacked British officials, missionaries and police stations. However, British captured Birsa Munda and suppressed the rebels. Munda rebellion led to the passing of Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act in 1908. This act tried to help the Mundas by banning forced labour. The act assured local customary land rights to the Mundas in their villages. Besides the above act, the government initiated several steps to bring the tribals and administration closer to each other. Government officials were now stationed closer to the Munda villages so that they could speedily attend to the grievances of tribal people. The religion also contributed to the growing socio-economic consciousness among the tribals in Chota Nagpur. Trivia: Birsa Munda's call against the British Raj was Abua Raj Ste Jana, Maharani Raj Tandu Jana. It means, let the kingdom of Queen be ended and our kingdom be established. Trivia: the Jarawa people are one of the last surviving tribes in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Trivia: Birsa Munda is the only traditional leader whose portrait hangs in the central hall of the Indian Parliament.